are just talking about one of the boroughs, one of the 5 boroughs of New York. So we're just talking about the island of Manhattan. But most people consider Manhattan as being New York City. So yesterday we were down in the downtown financial district, down this area down here. And you'll notice there's this long area of low-rise buildings until you get to this massive high-rise conglomeration here. And this is the Midtown district. And then continuing up the island, you have Central Park. So this rather unique, and it is a unique skyline. In fact, it's described as New York architectural style. And so you'll see a lot of buildings around the world and people describe it as New York architectural style. It is unique, and there's several reasons why there you get this unique thing. Up until about the mid-1800s, the city of New York was this small settlement down in the financial district, the downtown area. And this area here was mainly the outer businesses, industry, farms. In fact, even by the 1850s, when they were excavating Central Park, there were still tribes of Native American Indians living in this area in Central Park. So this really was out in the wilderness. However, you had the massive immigration in mid-19th century, where the immigrants coming into New York from the old world, and of course, a lot of them moved out to other centres in the USA, but a lot stayed in New York. Now, the city itself was obviously bounded. You can't expand east or west. You can only go up the island. And it was almost described as like a human glacier, slowly moving up the island. As the population increases, the housing moves up, the businesses move up, demand moves up. And so you had this confluence of effects in the late 1800s, where the city had expanded up to this Midtown area, but you also had some other factors came in. The first was the development of steel-framed skyscrapers. William LeBaron Jenney in 1884 in Chicago developed the first steel skeleton-framed building. It's 8 stories high. It's called a skyscraper. And at around the same time, you had Elisha Otis developed the safety elevator, and he displayed that at the 1893 Columbian Exhibition, again in Chicago. These 2 factors basically said a building could be as tall as you like, the sky was the limit. However, New York also had this extra benefit. In the bedrock of New York City, of Manhattan Island, is a rock called schist, which is a very, very hard basalt-like rock. And for that reason, you don't have to dig for a massively high building. You don't have to dig massively deep for foundations because it's such a solid bedrock. In fact, it's one of the reasons why there are so few underground car parks in New York. It's just that it's so hard to dig down into this bedrock. And so these massive high towers could be built without very little foundations and with the steel frame and the elevators going up. Bear in mind, as we talked about yesterday, the whole purpose of New York City is commerce, to make money. And obviously, if you can put a 40-story building on a little square block of land and rent it out to all the tenants, you're going to make a lot more money than it being a 3 or 4-story building. So during the end of the First World War, the booming 1920s, economy's booming, and the development, this technology had developed. All of a sudden, there's this race to build these massive skyscrapers, rather unique skyscrapers here in this Midtown area. Matthew's going to be starting off here, down here at the Rockefeller Center, what was then at the time the largest urban development in the world, moving through past St. Patrick's Cathedral and past some of the really iconic buildings of this Midtown area. We'll be looking at Lever House, the Seagram Building, the GE Building, and down the Grand Central Terminal and onto the Chrysler Building.
Hi, Stuart. We're right in the heart of Midtown here today. I'm standing on 6th Avenue, which is the kind of main thoroughfare running through Midtown, so just a little bit over towards the East River from Broadway, where we were on yesterday. I'm standing pretty much in the center of the world's media industry. That's what Midtown is really, this part of Midtown is really known for today. And in fact, I can start off with a little shout out to Australia. Over there is the News Corporation building. Rupert Murdoch's office is somewhere up the top of that, looking down upon us all, us mere plebs, down here on the city street. But it's more famous, of course, for the buildings that were started off the development of Midtown. And so today I really want to take a bit of an architectural tour of Midtown, starting with the earliest buildings that led to the development of the skyscraper race here, which Stuart mentioned, and then ending with some of the more modern buildings from the 70s and 80s that helped redefine vertical architecture. So there's a real mix that we can see as we walk through Midtown today. But I'm going to start off by discussing the Rockefeller Center. And in fact, we'll spend a little bit of time here because it is a rather extraordinary creation. We're standing in front of what's called 30 Rockefeller, which is technically the main building of the complex, but it's very hard to get a sense of scale of it until we kind of walk around. The Rockefeller Center, after all, is a complex of 14 different buildings, not just an individual one. The land that it's built on was bought by the Rockefeller family in 1928. And at that time, all of this area was slums. Some large houses were placed on 5th and Madison Avenue for the wealthier classes, but most of here was crowded tenements and older buildings, things that you might see in Brooklyn today. But there was considered ripe for redevelopment. Stuart mentioned the Manhattan schist, this hard rock, which skyscrapers are generally anchored into in Manhattan. Well, it comes closest to the surface, right downtown, where the financial district is, and around here. So it was considered a good place if you wanted to build skyscrapers, that there would be opportunity here. But when Rockefeller bought the land here, and this is John D. Rockefeller Jr., not the senior, but we'll talk a little bit about senior when we go further in. When Jr. bought the land, it was for a new location for the Metropolitan Opera House, which used to be on Broadway. So in 1928, they were going to redevelop this whole site as a big cultural arts complex, a bit what the Lincoln Center is today, was supposed to be here. But then shortly after, evicting all the tenants and clearing all the land, in 1929, the stock market crashed and the Metropolitan Opera was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. There was no way that it could afford to open a new location. So the Rockefellers are left sitting on all this land in the middle of Midtown, and John D. makes a bold decision. He says, all right, well, I guess we're going to have to develop the land ourselves rather than donate it to the Opera House. And if we're going to do that, why don't we build the world's largest office complex? It was considered a kind of a crazy plan at the time in 1929. Not many people would have been willing to risk their fortunes developing such a large office complex amidst economic misfortune. But the Rockefellers reasoned that the economy would return, and when they did, Midtown could be ripe for redevelopment. And just like the old Nat King Cole song goes, although they all laughed at Rockefeller Center, now they're crowding to get in. 126,000 tenants applied to be in the building when it first opened in 1939. So it became a very success story of the development of Midtown, and everything you see around us on 6th Avenue came after this original site. So we're going to walk up to the Rockefeller Center and talk a little bit about this building. Well, actually, while we're waiting for the lights to change, I'll talk a little bit about the main tenant of this building. The 30 Rockefeller is home to NBC, the National Broadcasting Corporation. It's pretty famous for that. The Tonight Show is filmed inside. In fact, there are 35 television studios located inside the building. The kind of genesis of this is interesting, why this important tenant sort of is located here. Around the same time that the Rockefellers are developing this land, there's a new broom pushing through the American media industry being caused by radio. And in particular, one man is associated with this building more than any other, a guy called David Sarnoff, and Stuart can probably throw up a slide of him. He was a Belarusian immigrant who came to the United States around World War I, and was convinced at that time that radio, which at that time was mostly used for point-to-point communication, could be used as a broadcasting medium, an idea of projecting from one person to lots of different people. He was working for the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. You might remember RCA, or RCA Victor. He wanted to demonstrate the potential of this technology here in New York to his bosses. So what he did in 1921 was place radio receivers at the biggest boxing match of that year, between Georges Carpentier and Joe Louis. It was a huge title match. There were 300,000 people who tried to crowd in to see the match. So Sarnoff recognized that if he put radio transmitters, receivers in the boxing ring, and then place transmitters in places like Times Square, he could build up the idea that radio could be used as a broadcasting mechanism. And it became a massive success. people rushed out to buy radio sets saying, oh, well, we could listen to things like sports matches on these devices. But then they had a problem. They need content for all these radio sets that RCA is selling. So the National Broadcasting Corporation was founded to create content to play over the radios 24 hours a day. Sarnoff became its first director, and then he decided to put a lease on one of the largest new buildings at Rockefeller Center so they would have studios to record all their content. And so that is the genesis of why NBC started here and why the area is known as Radio City, or at least it was more commonly in the 20s and 30s, because all the world's radio programs initially were recorded here. Of course, over time, other channels opened up. Now the industry is kind of more diffuse. At the moment, we're standing in front of the doors to 30 Rockefeller Center. I'll talk a little bit about the architecture here and all over the building as we go through. The Rockefeller Center is really one of the masterpieces of Art Deco architecture. Art Deco is not necessarily a consistent artistic philosophy, but it's all about excitement with the modern age. That's what really captures Art Deco. It's a period where American designers and architects are excited about the promises of technology, and they want to incorporate that into their built form. So Art Deco usually places themes like progress at the center of it and tries to capture that in artistic form. And so if you see in this mural by Barry Faulkner, it exactly captures the spirit of the Art Deco age. You see these great sort of modern Greek-style muses in the middle, representing things like thought, spoken word, biology, physics, poetry, sciences, all these things which mankind was progressing in very quickly in the 20s and 30s. And on the edges of the mural, you see these demons which are being chased away by these new developments. Ignorance is being cast out into the fires of Hades by these new sort of heroes of the modern age. This is perfect kind of embodiment of what Art Deco is all about. But also the details. Art Deco is very distinguishable by its use of straight lines and straight shapes. Even if you look at the metalwork around the doorway inside the building, you see these very thin, accurate lines. That's because only the machine age could create those shapes. And so as part of the excitement of the era, they're trying to kind of use everything that looks machine-made, not handmade, not rough and kind of rounded, but rather hard-edged. And this is kind of what Art Deco is all about. Now, the Rockefeller Center, which we'll walk around the corner of, the Rockefeller Center has lots and lots of small details like this. It really rewards a close look. A lot of people walk past this complex, kind of glance at it, see it, but don't really spend the time to look at the little details. So I want to try and spend a bit of this tour just showing some of those details. We're walking past at the moment the first building that was actually completed on the site, which is Radio City Music Hall, kind of one of the most famous venues in the city. And of course, it was all part of that need to create broadcastable material for the new radio sets they were selling. So the Radio City Orchestra, much like the BBC Orchestra in London, was set up to help create content to play 24 hours a day on radio stations. But it was also a popular variety style music hall. The interior of Radio City is pretty incredible. It can hold 6,200 people, which makes it one of the largest theater venues in the city. It has a kind of a telescoping 8-tier proscenium arch inside. It's a pretty incredible experience to listen to something in Radio City. The format has kind of changed from its original era. Until the 1970s, it was really like a variety hall with all kinds of things that you might hear broadcast on the radio performed there. Today, though, it's mostly sort of big end performances that you'll see. You can see these little roundels up there, which probably Sterling's been showing you on the camera, by Hildreth Mier, another brilliant Art Deco artist showing the muses, like Terpsichore there, the muse of dancing, and various others. I think Cleo, Calliope can be seen kind of going back in the circles, and there's some around the other side as well. As we walk further up, you can see the entrance to the observation deck and the Rainbow Room, one of the more famous locations within the center, but the Rainbow Room, I think at the moment has been reorganized due to COVID. So it's had about 10 different owners over the last 30 years. So it keeps kind of changing.
Matthew, just while you're heading up, I'll show everyone a map of the whole center.
Oh yeah, I think I put one on the deck.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And you've got, first of all, the beautiful image of 30 Rockefeller Center, which is the tallest tower in the centre. And just to give you an idea, so Matthew started over here on 6th Avenue, outside the main entrance. He's walked down past Radio City Music Hall. However, all these buildings make up the Rockefeller Center. So you can see what a massive development it was. And we'll end up in Rockefeller Plaza and looking at a couple of the other buildings and make our way out to 5th Avenue. But again, the image here, the main building, 30 Rockefeller Center, and you can see this Art Deco, the verticality of the Art Deco style buildings. Okay.
So we'll cut around the corner here and have a look at the rear of the main building. This is where we can kind of see a couple of famous elements and tell one of the more famous stories about its construction. Firstly, though, you can get a pretty good shot from the rear of the building, that height and scale. One of the kind of classic features of Art Deco architecture is the use of ancient symbols of the classics. And here you have Zeus, for example, reaching down to mankind with the little quote underneath it, "Wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy time." And as you look up across the building, you can get a sort of sense of the scale of it going back. If we could get the panning, yeah. I don't know if Sterling can duck in and look at the lobby area, but there's an important story kind of associated with the politics of the construction of the building. The mural, which you may have heard tell of initially, done for the center, was done by Diego Rivera, which I'll let Sterling just capture some vision of the lobby, though. I won't walk in there with him just so it doesn't look too suspicious. Me walking around, you've got to be a little bit stealthy doing a live on site. But the mural you'll see into there, this is the main lobby of the Rockefeller Center. It was done by a man named Jose Maria Sert. And it portrays all sorts of exciting American values like freedom and industry, and has a high emphasis on technology and the kind of mankind developing in a sort of a progressive manner in the 1920s. Again, that Art Deco sort of theme of man conquering the world and sort of remaking it in his own image. But this is not the original mural that was there, and Stuart can probably throw up to you a slide showing part of that original mural, which was called Man at the Crossroads. It was done by Diego Rivera, the famous Spanish muralist, Mexican muralist. And it was commissioned initially to kind of show the full spread of humankind captured within a single panorama. And he does this incredibly detailed image, which this one is actually a recreation of what he did at the Palacio Real in Mexico City. But it shows mankind dominating all the elements of science and technology around it. But I also highlighted on that picture an image that caused a lot of consternation. In that red box, you can see Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and Leon Trotsky. And so when John D. Rockefeller Jr. inspected the work of Rivera and saw this was happening, he freaked out, said, "No way, absolutely not. We cannot have these prominent communists depicted in an all-American mural." And so there was a dispute between Rivera and the Rockefeller Corporation. It wasn't resolved. Rivera refused to change the mural. And to be fair to Rivera, he did have figures like Abraham Lincoln, etc., depicted in the mural, so it wasn't totally one-sided. But the Rockefellers, kind of had their way. Rivera walked off the project, and the original mural wasn't just painted over, it was chipped off. The plaster was peeled off the walls and burnt. So the original mural just does not exist in any way, shape, or form. However, Rivera luckily recreated it in Mexico, so we can still see what it would look like today. The replacement mural, which Sterling showed you off, is okay, but it's nothing kind of like the original excitement that the Rivera mural would have had. Nonetheless, though, there still is plenty of really cool art that's still located intact around the Rockefeller Center. And I want to draw your attention to this one, which is this large bas-relief by Isamu Noguchi. This is on the front of the Associated Press building. This was originally the home of AP, the largest wire service in the world. And you can see 5 figures here depicting the tools of the journalism trade as they were in the 1930s. So you see a telephone, a man with a writing pad, a typewriter, and you should just be able to make up at the top a person with a still camera and a video camera, which was very new technology in the 1930s. But there's another reason why I like to kind of point out this building and this piece of art, because there's a sort of an important association to be made between them with the genesis of the Rockefeller Center and the newsroom industry. In the Rockefeller family, which was the wealthiest family ever to have existed, really, John D. Rockefeller Sr., definitely, even by today's terms, still the richest man ever to live. Rockefeller was a modern kind of hero for much of the 19th century, controlling 80% of the world's oil industry at its height. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was, for many Americans, kind of this heroic figure, this sort of representation of modernism and everything that man could accomplish. But there's an interesting sort of character that comes into his life around the turn of the century, and Stuart can probably throw up a slide of her, a woman named Ida Tarbell, whose father had been driven out of business by the Rockefeller oil machine when she was fairly young. She had grown up and become a journalist in New York City, and in the turn of the century, she started becoming interested in investigating how it was exactly that Rockefeller had made so much money and how the corporation did its business. And what she did was something that had been totally unique for the era. She went around and conducted what we now call investigative journalism. She started to piece together the story of the Rockefeller Oil Company, Standard Oil, through court documents, things that were sitting in city halls and city records offices. She found old ledgers, and in those days, people didn't destroy records nearly as often, and they were just sort of lying around unsecured. And so painstakingly crisscrossing the country, she started to build this picture of a company that was illegally colluding with railroads to force other companies out of business, was illegally colluding with other entities within oil trusts to kind of fix prices and drive out competitors as well. And then she struck up a relationship with the vice president of Standard Oil then, who, for reasons that are historically unclear, seemed very willing to tell her everything she asked about how the company was doing business. Again, probably not expecting a woman to be in investigative journalism. Assumed she was doing a puff piece on the history of the company. Well, long story short, she compiled all this information in 1904 into a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company. And it's considered one of the most important first investigative journalism reports in the world. And it completely changed the reputation of the Rockefeller family. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was never really the same after it. He started to becoming more of a public recluse, and eventually the government acted against Standard Oil and broke it up. Now, how this ties all back to this building is that the son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., eventually became upset and eventually became somewhat disgusted with the way that the family and his father had made the family's money. In fact, all the Rockefeller children progressively after this point began to turn away from the family business and to look into ways to give that money back. All the Rockefeller children ultimately became major philanthropists. In fact, the Rockefellers ended up becoming the biggest philanthropists in history as well. And part of that is what motivated John D. Rockefeller Jr. to build the Rockefeller Center. Because after all, one of the major accomplishments that he saw was keeping 50,000 construction workers employed during the height of the Great Depression, because the Rockefellers employed huge amounts of crews around the city to build their buildings, and so this was one way to keep them occupied. So kind of recognizing that Ida Tarbell was an important figure in turning the reputation of the Rockefellers and also turning towards philanthropy. When they opened this building in 1937, Ida Tarbell, quite senior by this year, actually opened the building as recognition of basically inventing journalism and also helping turn the Rockefellers towards charity. So that kind of is where the story all comes full circle. I'm going to take us around now to the first of what is called the international buildings. So we've got the main core buildings of Rockefeller Center, which we've just gone past, that sit on 6th Avenue. And then behind it, most of the rest of the 14 buildings have called international buildings because they have aspirational country names attached to them in order to hopefully, in their mind, attract clients from overseas. When they built the Rockefeller Center, they hoped that major corporations from Europe would locate their headquarters here. There's a relief in the side of the wall here that was done by Lee Laurie that kind of shows this aspiration of the Rockefeller Center. You can see it's kind of nicely lit up now at this time of night, showing the old world and the new world coming together on the right-hand side, you see the old world, a lion at the bottom, and then architecture from the Middle East and the Mesopotamia, and then a ship traveling between from the old world to the new world, which depicted on the left with the eagle and a factory and a sort of a Mesoamerican piece of architecture as well. And that was what the Rockefeller Center hoped to achieve. This is actually standing on the side of a building that was known as the Italian Building. The hope that Italian companies like Esso and things from that day would locate their headquarters here. And they didn't keep that name during World War II. They changed the name to just the International Building. But many of the other buildings in the complex do still keep that name structure. I think we'll try and cross here to see the Rockefeller skating rink, which you might be familiar with. During the winter time, this is covered over with ice, and it's one of the most fashionable places to be seen skating. So if you're very, very confident at doing that, it's always a kind of a highlight of New York. At the moment, they're refurbishing some of the parts underneath the Rockefeller Center, but I think if Sterling gets up close to the perspex, you should be able to see a little bit into the rink today. Or in fact, he's going to try and maybe, you can just kind of make it out there. The centerpiece of the rink is that statue by Paul Manship, and it's a pretty clever little effect that was created because you can see Prometheus there with fire in his hands. And if you see the visual line that goes between him and Zeus on the back of the Rockefeller Center, it's supposed to indicate Prometheus stealing fire from Zeus to give to mankind. Again, kind of echoing that idea of the dominance of man and his creative abilities in this sort of progressive modern age. As we turn around, we're heading up between two buildings. The one on my left is known as the British Empire Building. The one on my right is known as the French Building. And as you might have guessed, the area of land between the two, which we're walking up now, is known as the English Channel. At the end of the English Channel, you can actually see the lights on at the moment of Saks Fifth Avenue, one of the most prestigious department stores in New York. And actually, one of the few areas of this part, or one of the few buildings of this area that sort of survives from the 19th century. A lot of the architecture is quite modern in Midtown. Only the department stores and a couple of the manor houses that were built here are still here from that earlier pre-development era. We'll turn around in front of the British Empire Building. We'll look briefly at the doors. All the little international buildings have something supposed to be representing their country. This one represents the British Empire with the little sun down the bottom, showing that the sun never sets on the empire. Supposedly, each of the figurines does represent one of the British Empire's colonies. And allegedly, the man with the sheets, with the side that the top wheat is supposed to be Australia. I can assure everyone at home this is exactly what I look like without clothes on, so it's a very accurate rendition of Australian. New Zealand is a little wool figurine there. All right. As we cross over to the last little part of the Rockefeller Center we'll look at. See some of the details from the front of the Italian Building. So the last feature we'll talk about in the Rockefeller Center is this glorious statue of Atlas bearing the world on his shoulders. Again, done by Lee Laurie, the sculptural designer for most of the Rockefeller Center's features and details. Laurie here depicts Atlas in kind of this half stride moving forward again, that kind of theme of the Art Deco era of man progressing overall. But there's a kind of a second layer of meaning to this statue due to its context. We just walked past the center of the complex, and you might wonder, well, why wasn't this the largest and most important statue placed in the middle of the complex? Well, there's an important kind of tactical reason. You'll see on the other side of the street there, St. Patrick's Cathedral from 1877. This is the home of the Catholic Archdiocese of New York, an important site of Catholic pilgrimage for many New Yorkers, especially when this building was being constructed, as in the 1920s, Italian immigrants and immigrants from Ireland were some of the largest groups representing the city. The St. Patrick's Day parade prominently passes by the cathedral, so it was a very well-known religious site in the city. Laurie wants to place this statue of Atlas facing the cathedral, basically to show you as a sort of a challenge to the religious authority of the city, kind of as if he's saying, no, God didn't make all of this, man has. Now, interestingly, the original design for this statue doesn't have the cloud strategically placed around Atlas's groin. The idea initially in the sketches was that a rather impressive manhood would be pointing directly at the cathedral doors. At the last minute, some cooler heads prevailed and a cloud was sort of placed over the bottom. So it's not quite as provocative as it might have been. But again, capturing the sort of thematic concerns of the Art Deco era. Maybe we can see inside the lobby of the International Building as well. I don't know if it's open. The buildings are not always open on the weekends. But even if we can't see in there, I'll mention that sort of mounted overlooking this lobby area is a bust of one of the heroes of the Art Deco era, someone who's depicted quite frequently in art and in murals of this period, and that's Charles Lindbergh. He was kind of considered the sort of archetypal man of the Art Deco era, a man who'd built his own plane and crossed the Atlantic single-handedly. And so you see like planes and trains and so transportation technology featured quite a lot in the art of the Art Deco period as well. These things are kind of sort of being driven as examples of the excitements that were coming out of the era.
Matthew,
Right.
Matthew, it's kind of interesting to note that the International Building originally, like you had the French building, the British building, it was going to be the German building. But obviously the middle of the 1930s, Rockefeller definitely changed the name to the National Building. We just had a question from Graham asking, are any of the Rockefeller family still involved in the ownership of the Rockefeller Center?
No. There's now a large conglomerate of hedge funds that actually owns the Rockefeller Center. I mean, they may well have a stake in that hedge fund, but do they directly manage it? No. In fact, any complex of this size in New York is pretty much beyond private ownership now, given the sort of money involved and the capital required to ensure it, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, as far as I know, no, there's no direct involvement. It's like look at the little details you can see around the Rockefeller Center. This is the part I love. Everything for a complex of this scale and size. Every address is sort of hewn into a brass plate on the door. Even each tree box, each tree planter is kind of a featured grill with an Art Deco design and stamp placed on it. So incredibly detailed complex. Anyway, we're going to move on from the Rockefeller Center now and make our way down towards Lever House and some of the areas of Midtown. The area we're walking down, it's Fifth Avenue, and this is one of the most desirable shopping districts in the city. You can see all sorts of fabulously expensive shops, which I've never really gone into, but I can only admire from a distance. It's always changing the facades of Fifth Avenue as fashionable fashion houses kind of move in and put in showcase stores, etc. So they're kind of looking quite pretty tonight in the evening light.
Just while we're going past it, Matthew, it'd be good if Sterling could just highlight the Cartier Building, because it's such a great example of an original Fifth Avenue mansion.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the Cartier Building is one of the 19th century era retail locations that's still located here.
And it was actually a private mansion, so it was a private house before it became retail. Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the Villard mansions, I think. Yeah. Henry Villard was a wealthy railroader. He owned a lot of buildings on this street. One more block down. In the far distance there, I don't know how much we can get a shot of it, but you'll see this building with a serrated edge. Yep, Sterling expertly pointed out, that's Trump Tower, if no one's ever seen it before. Unfortunately, I don't hate it. I actually think it's one of the better architectural designs of a Trump building done by Dare Scoot in the 1980s. The reason it has this serrated edge is to create the maximum amount of corner offices and corner penthouses. This was calculated to be the most efficient way to get high rents out of people. Controversial building because it actually destroyed the old Bonwit Teller department store, which was like Bergdorf Goodman's in its day, a really nice 19th century apartment building. So a little bit controversial. We were just discussing ourselves. We're not sure how often Trump is actually there today. During his presidency, this was a lot of this part of the street would be periodically closed off as the president came into town and for security concerns around Barron. And we're not sure today how much time he really spends here. He's now officially moved to Mar-a-Lago in Florida. All right. So I wanted to come down this little street on the way to leave a house to point out one of the little hidden gems of New York, and something that I kind of delighted in discovering about 10 years ago and now kind of obsess over and looking for more of these. It's called a pocket park. You see it here, and they've closed off at the moment because of COVID precautions, etc. But it's a good example of a little bit of urban architecture that is sort of an only in New York thing. This one's called Paley Park, and it's literally just a block of land that was bought up by William S. Paley to dedicate back to the city as a private park. So it's not owned by the city. It's just a little space to give it a sense of openness, I guess, in Midtown. There are lots and lots of kind of public parks in New York, but not many of them located in Midtown. The interesting thing about pocket parks, there's usually a waterfall on at the back of Paley Park to give sort of a sense of grey noise and to kind of, give a bit of an audio block from the rest of the city. But the interesting thing about Paley Park and many pocket parks in the city is the complexity of the arrangements around them. Because one thing you'll see here is that not only is there a little bit of open space here, but behind it, the building doesn't go very high for a Midtown building. And that's because Paley Park actually owns the air rights over the top of that building behind it. The whole reason, of course, being if you want any light to get into this park and any air circulation, you're going to need some space in the for that stuff to come down. And so this is kind of one of the more controversial aspects of these parks. They often bought these air rights when they were very cheap in the 1960s and 1970s, and now they're actually standing on extremely expensive air real estate. So some of these are under enormous pressure to be liquidated, but so far most of them have survived, and they're usually run by insoluble trusts that just allow for the maintenance of the park and nothing else. So these very wealthy trusts have got enough money to last 100, 200 years to maintain the park now, which is kind of interesting. So there are a lot of these little private parks that have sprung up in New York over the decades. I think there are about 12 all up that are officially counted in New York. So kind of just a little interesting tidbit. If you're past one of these in New York, now you'll kind of know what it is. All right, we'll now make our way down to leave a house. Just about a block down. We're going to be crossing Madison Avenue, another prominent shopping destination in the city. Madison and Fifth, in fact, this has been the case for a long, long time. Madison and Fifth Avenue used to be covered with expensive mansions. Places like the Vanderbilt Mansion were on Fifth Avenue, as it was kind of one of the more elite areas of the city to settle. None of those large mansions are really sustainable in the 20th century. So nearly all of them are gone. There's a couple that have been left in place, like the Lottie Palace Hotel of New York. But by and large, most of that's gone now. Oh yeah, Sterling just pointed out, there's a steam pipe. If you were on the tour with me yesterday, we're asking about where did that iconic steam come from? Well, there's an example. That's one of the steam mains having burst. And that's obviously they've got to repair it on Monday. And for now, they just have a tube directing the steam out into the atmosphere.
It really is one of those iconic scenes of New York. You always get those nighttime images with the steam coming up out of the street. It's also worth mentioning and noticing if everybody, yesterday we were down the downtown historic and all the little Dutch wiggly streets with names on them. In 1811, the commissioners in New York designed the plan, the grid pattern for New York, and laid down this grid plan stretching all the way up to 125th and beyond. And this is why you've got these very rigid rectilinear blocks up here and the incredibly unimaginative names like First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue, and 52nd, 53rd, 54th Streets. Anyway, right there.
Yeah, it's interestingly, they deviate from the pattern only slightly. You've got Park, Lexington, and Madison Avenue, which are outside the numbering order for various reasons. Those are the streets we're mostly on today. But yes, by and large, they're nearly all numbered up in this area. So the building we're now looking at, or Sterling should be getting good footage of now, is Lever House from 1952. One of the most important architectural designs of the modern era, really. Lever House is really one of the very first modern office buildings. And in fact, it might not look super remarkable to you. And that's in part because it is the prototype for a lot of modern office buildings, basically a glass box. Prior to the construction of Lever House, we saw buildings like the Woolworth Building yesterday. There wasn't exactly a lot of variation in architecture, and there wasn't a high use of steel and glass. These were fairly new materials in the 1940s and 1950s that were being experimented with. When it comes to Lever House, what was being developed at that time was small-scale constructions in the late 1940s and 1950s using glass and steel prominently, like the Farnsworth House in Illinois, the Glass House in Connecticut. And as it happened, this was kind of coming into vogue as on the avant-garde of architecture. The Lever Brothers Soap Company had a president in the 1950s named Charles Luckman, who was himself a kind of frustrated architect. He had wanted to go to architecture school, ended up in business, but as it happens, when he became president, a young wunderkind president of Lever Brothers, he decided when they were building a new headquarters of their business in New York to hire the most avant-garde architectural firm he could, and he wanted to give them a brief to do something totally new and different. The man they hired was named Gordon Bunshaft. He worked with a firm called Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and this is what he came up with. A glass box, a single glass rectangle rising out of the ground with this sort of mezzanine floor wrapping around a forecourt in front of it. This is a totally different kind of concept, a paradigm shift, if you will, in architecture. Prior to the development of buildings like Lever House, the dominating paradigm for building a skyscraper was that you filled as much of the block as possible. You see a lot of old, especially in Art Deco buildings, but also prior to this, a sort of a wedding cake skyscraper. You might have seen them around New York, but they're tiered upwards. These were to allow basically as much massing as was legally possible at every level up and towards the sky. New York City had laws that dictated how much mass could be on a block at what height, and so that was the sort of ideal way. You filled up every available space. Well, Lever House changes all that. It says we don't need every single inch of floor space if we design the building efficiently and tall. So we'll make the glass rectangle very tall and very thin and very efficiently designed. So you don't have a lot of walkways and stairways, but just a single bank of elevators taking everyone up. And that means we get to free up all this space in front of it to create public space or employee space. The mezzanine floor that goes around it is all amenities for the employees. It has a cafeteria and toilet spaces, et cetera, et cetera. And inside the main tower of the building, and Stuart can probably throw up a slide, was all open plan, which is completely coming into vogue. It's pretty new in the 1950s. And so what you see is that dread of every modern office worker, a lack of distinction between the individual spaces, just rows of desks placed around in spaces that could be freely converted. And that requires pulling out individual rooms and offices and just having open floor space as much as possible. So this was kind of a revolution in architecture. This building was on the cover of Life magazine. People discussed it endlessly as the kind of new vogue for architecture. And as we know today, a lot of buildings descend in one way or the other from Lever House. There was a second architect on the project who's not mentioned nearly as much. Her name was Natalie DeBlois. She's in fact the one who came up with the concept for the mezzanine deck around here. She was technically the co-designer of Lever House with Bunshaft. She was a young female architect working in the firm. Her knowledge of her involvement on the project wasn't really known until she died in the 1990s, and an obituary was written that had sort of uncovered the evidence of her building. Unfortunately, while working in the firm, she had rebuffed the advances of one of the male partners who had then fired her, and then her name was scrubbed and cut off all the blueprints for the building. So it's only through great detective work that we know that there are actually two original geniuses who developed this building. We're going to cross the street now and look at another revolutionary building that's just right across the road. Sterling will get pretty good footage pretty quickly though of it. And you can see it better from this part of the street than we will when we're right in front of it. And this is the Seagram Building from 1958. This tall, sheer, black and orange glass box, classic of modernist design. The Seagram Building was an answer to Lever House. It was deliberately built here, and it was deliberately built in this style to kind of compete with Lever House. The Seagram Corporation wanted to have their own new modern headquarters here on Park Avenue. Lever House was turning heads. It inspired a whole lot of new designs around the city. And so the Seagram company gave Ludwig Mies van der Rohe a blank check to build his ultimate modern masterpiece here in order to to provide an answer to Lever House. The Seagram Building is the archetype of what we now call the Miesian box, another popular prototype for many buildings in the modern era. In fact, there are kind of copies of Seagram House you can find all around the country. There are even some all around the United States. There are even some in Australia and Europe that copy the similar design. The Miesian box is pretty breathtaking in its simplicity. It incorporates nothing basically. The only kind of geometrical feature of it is usually the inset lobby area that kind of cuts into the bottom of the building. Otherwise, it's just a sheer flat facade going all the way up. The way Ludwig Mies van der Rohe designed it was that the entire thing snaps to a grid. So if you look at the tile pattern below, you'll see that everything in this complex snaps to this grid of tiles. Even features like grates in the ground sit on the vertices between tiles. And so the whole thing is like a total work of art, consumed like on a giant piece of grid paper. Inside, it's got this highly austere, but in a way, beautiful kind of architectural style. Mies van der Rohe loved what he called honesty in materials. He didn't want facade, and so he wanted nothing but the most expensive marbles to decorate the walls, because they didn't need to be painted. They didn't need to be covered with anything. They would just sort of be naturally beautiful by themselves. As a result, this building was fabulously expensive. That's travertine marble around the elevator banks. Incredibly expensive then and quite expensive today. But it was considered kind of a masterpiece of modern design in its era. One of the things I kind of find interesting about the Seagram Building is actually this forecourt area. So if anyone knows anything about Mies van der Rohe, he was obsessed with kind of controlling people through architecture. He felt that by building things right, you suggested the way people should use things. And so he doesn't want to leave ambiguity in spaces. He wants to make it very clear where you go, where you're supposed to walk and where you're not supposed to walk. Observe, for example, over here on the other side of the pond, there are these benches made out of another fine marble. But there's a water feature jammed right in front of them, so you don't think of that as a seating area. It's decorative only. And these other trees and plants here. But if you come here during the day, you'll kind of observe that people actually sort of step through the pond so they could sit on it and have their lunch. And it's sort of interesting because there was a famous New York sociologist named William White who actually spent 3 months in the New York City Racket Club on the other side of the street, observing the court of this building and asking, well, is Mies right? Has he designed a space that suggests how people should use it? You know, is his plan working? And he found overwhelmingly they weren't. He has a great documentary film, a short film you can find on YouTube called The Sociology of Small Spaces. And it sort of looks at spaces like this and goes, the architects have it all wrong. People are just going to use spaces however they want to, whatever's convenient to them. So it's kind of a funny little story that sort of sits with this area. Oh yeah, you just see in the distance there, leave a house on the other side of the street. You can also see actually rising up next to it, you know, the top of it is obscured by this mist which has descended on the city. This is one of the newest pencil towers in New York, this kind of white crisscross building designed by Raphael Vignoli. It was supposed to be a reference to a New York City trash can, supposedly. These are springing up all over Midtown at the moment, these very thin towers, because the New York City government is not really willing at this time to allow further mergers of blocks. They don't want to kind of further create mega blocks like they used to in the 1960s and 70s. They're really keen on keeping small blocks intact. So as a result, developers have to build pretty tall, thin towers in order to make the use of their land. This pencil tower is an example of one of them, 432 Park. It's a very expensive luxury apartment development. We just read actually recently in the Times a couple of months ago that it's beleaguered by engineering problems. The developer kind of has abandoned the building, and of course now there are problems with water sealing and wind tolerance and things, and apparently it's noisy and the elevators are kind of unfinished, etc., etc. I know in Australia we've got a reputation for developers running off from luxury apartment blocks as well. So I guess the same problem here. This black protrusion coming from the side of the building is the original Four Seasons restaurant. It was designed as part of the original Seagram Building complex. Philip Johnson was the apprentice to Mies van der Rohe on this project and designed it. Stuart might be able to throw up a slide showing the interior of the Four Seasons, which when it opened was the be-all and end-all of fine dining in the city. A story I like to tell about the Four Seasons is the involvement of Mark Rothko, who was one of the great abstract painters of the 20th century. And as that reputation, having that reputation, Mies van der Rohe and Johnson tried to secure Rothko to do paintings for the interior of the Four Seasons restaurant. Rothko was a kind of a famous socialist, and it was sort of not understood exactly by his friends, why he would accept a commission for an extremely snooty upscale facility. One story goes that apparently Rothko was fooled or lied to and told by Johnson that his paintings were actually going to be in an employee cafeteria within the building, and so they would, be an opportunity for the regular man to interact with his artworks. Another story goes, and if you had a look at those paintings and got a sense of them, you might get a sense of this. Another story goes, Rothko told to a man on a cruise line he once traveled on that the reason he painted them in there and painted them like that was to remind diners of a woman's certain time of the month, and in his words, hopefully make everyone in the facility throw up. So we don't exactly know what exactly the truth is. Those paintings are now in the Tate Modern, but that's originally they're known as the Four Seasons collection. As we come to behind the Seagram Building, we now look at another architectural and engineering wonder of Midtown. This is the Citigroup Center from 1977. You can see it quite uniquely stands upon 4 pylons located at the center rather than at the corners of the block. There's a very complicated but very specific reason for why this is. Sterling will be able to highlight over there a church that sits on the corner of this block. It's sort of a dark brown stone triangular building now. That's St. Peter's Lutheran Church, and it was here on this site. Initially, the whole block this Citigroup Center on was a church, St. Peter's Lutheran, when they came along in the 1970s. However, they no longer needed the whole block. The congregation was shrinking, And so they agreed to sell the land to Citigroup Corporation, but they had 3 demands they placed on the land sale deal. The first was that Citigroup had to build them a new church on the same block they were already located on. Secondly, that church had to be on one of the corners of that lot. And thirdly, the church could not be structurally connected to the Citigroup's tower they were going to build. So in order to overcome that challenge, a engineering firm was employed, run by Waldorf-Astoria, who was one of the most famous structural engineers in the country at that time. And they were told, well, can you design a skyscraper that's going to occupy most of the block still, but still be able to kind of be structurally separated from this church? And he says, yes, I think I can do it. I'm going to create this sort of tree-like structure where these central pylons are going to have these chevrons branching out from them behind those curtain walls to support the floors going above it. So that was the original plan. They built it. It was considering an architectural and engineering marvel when it opened in 1977. Except there was a problem. A student at Princeton University named Diane Hartley in 1978 was studying this building and doing the maths on the engineering as part of an assignment for her college dissertation. And she did the maths and she found that didn't work out. It seemed to her that the way it had been built, if there were quartering winds, that is winds coming from a diagonal direction on the building, it seemed very likely the whole building would collapse. She could not find any fault in her maths. Her lecturer could not find any fault in her maths. So she sent her results to Massurier's firm and said, well, what do you think? What did I go wrong here? She never got a response to her letter. However, in 1978, the Citigroup Center crisis began, where by the cover of night, thousands of workers went into the building to re-weld the chevrons that held up the structural supports of the building to the plates of the floor. Basically, what had happened is originally they'd been bolted on these chevrons onto the floor. This wasn't strong enough. The shear strength of the bolts was not sufficient, so they had to weld all these plates between the wall and the floor. And this was all done secretly in 1978. They predict the building probably would have collapsed in 1979 had this structural fault not been discovered. Diane Hartley never got a response to her letter. The only reason she found out that anything had been changed was in 2005 or 6. They had a documentary about the building and the crisis, and it sort of said in the documentary, an unknown student informed Massurier's of his mistake. Well, she rang up and said that was me. So we now know her part in the story. So it still stands today, thanks to the ingenious findings of a single student from university. All right, we're now walking down Lexington Avenue. You might be able to see, peeking in the distance there, the Chrysler Building lit up. This is where we'll be able to end our tour down there in a little bit.
Matthew, it'd be good to take the opportunity now, maybe explain about the setback laws and the reason why you've got this quite unique architectural style.
Yeah, so in 1916, I think the year is, they had the zoning laws passed in New York. As new skyscrapers are going up, basically the problem emerged that the canyon floor, the floor of the city, was becoming shrouded in darkness. By building very large skyscrapers, you need to have allowances to get... Oh, someone's having a fit in the car next to me. Wait a sec. New York issues. All right. So in order to get enough sunlight down to the bottom of the city and to make it livable for everyone, they had to come up with a system that would allow sunlight to come down, and that was where the setback laws were instituted. Effectively, what it meant was at a certain height above the ground, a building had to be set back a certain amount in order to let light in, and so on and so forth. And so you get this kind of wedding cake type tiering structure in order to accommodate those laws. And so for a long time, every building sort of conformed with that concept of maximizing the amount of space at every available floor up to about the illegal limit, and then setting it back when they were legally required to. Now that isn't the way the zoning laws work in the city. Now there's actually only a finite amount of airspace that can be used in the whole city. They basically divided all of the air up into Manhattan into blocks. and there's a fierce secondary market of trading for those air rights. So there's actually, because of that, there's technically under the current laws a finite amount of skyscrapers that could ever be built. And once all those air rights are bought up, that'll be it. There'll be no more tall buildings that can be constructed. Usually what's happened in the most recent years, a lot of horse trading between companies who want to build, or construction companies want to build tall buildings. They'll go to sort of random people's houses in North Manhattan and say, can we buy your air rights? Because, you know, it's part of one of these blocks they can buy up from another area. So it also means that areas like the East Village and that are already low rise probably won't become high rise because they've already had their air rights bought up. So it's kind of an interesting system. The building that we're diagonally across from now is another Art Deco one, the GE building. Or the General Electric building. It's probably kind of difficult to see in the evening light, but Stuart can kind of throw up an image of the top of the building, which has this incredible kind of goddess of electricity depicted at the top. Just see you wait for Sterling to get across the street. All right. As we're walking down here, you might be able to see up and see this sort of relatively modern looking building with this serrated crown-like top on it. It was designed as one of the first postmodern buildings on Park Avenue. Postmodern architecture, which sort of started to become popular in the 1980s, is all about reflecting in surroundings and being built with a sensitivity to context. And so that particular example is supposed to reflect and mimic the design of the GE building. So this sort of Art Deco style crown is reflected in the top of this building. There are more and more postmodern buildings going up on Park Avenue because it's such a famous location. There are so many well-known buildings on the street. A lot of buildings kind of riff on those designs or incorporate design elements from them. All right, we're going to make our way back up onto Park.
Matthew, it seems very quiet to the streets. I suppose it is Sunday night.
Yeah, Sunday night.
Sunday evening. Yeah. How did you find the city? Because you're up here for the weekend, the long weekend. How did you find the city during the day, today and yesterday, in terms of crowds and people?
It's starting to come back, but it's still pretty quiet, I would say. Yeah, like nothing like what you'd expect in a regular period, I would say. Yeah, no, still pretty quiet. I mean, it was Memorial Day weekend, which would normally be pretty big in New York, and yeah, not a lot going on.
Yeah.
So now that we're back on Park, we're going to walk down towards Grand Central Station. As we go down, Sterling's just going to cross and get a little bit of footage of Park Avenue. And as we pass it, St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, 1916, a very unusual Byzantine revival building that was built here by Bertram Goodhue. We saw the St. Patrick's Cathedral a little bit further up. This is the Episcopal or Anglican response to that. It was done as a kind of, well, the story or idea behind it was a jewel box in the city. It's well known as a kind of, for its charity work, work with the homeless, work with the poor. It's kind of got that reputation. I've got a slide, I think, that shows the interior of this building somewhere in my deck.
Yeah. Yeah, just got that showing up now. It's a beautiful interior.
And then our next stop will be the Waldorf-Astoria, which is a good indication of the changing nature of Midtown. The Waldorf-Astoria It's kind of famous as the most elegant and important and desirable hotel in New York, at least it was, after it was finished in 1931. Another Art Deco masterpiece, although this one is being currently completely overhauled and refurbished. It bears the name Waldorf-Astoria because it was originally two hotels, the Waldorf Hotel and the Astoria, built by competing members of the same Astor family. John Jacob Astor was a very wealthy real estate speculator. He came here as part of the Hudson River fur trade in the 1700s, but recognized that as New York expanded, that eventually there would be a need for all of this land up here, that the city would eventually, pay top dollar to acquire land further up the island. And so the Astor family simply made their money by sitting on properties up to Midtown Manhattan from the 1700s onwards, and of course started selling them off in large blocks for small fortunes in the 1900s. But the Waldorf-Astoria is currently closed. When it was merged into a grand hotel, it was the most desirable of its day. Now it can barely turn a profit. And it kind of shows how Midtown is changing once again. It isn't only quiet on Park Avenue because it's, kind of COVID. Park Avenue has actually been declining in foot traffic pretty significantly since the 1990s. The city is moving, it's changing, it's always changing New York. And so when once the Waldorf-Astoria was kind of at the center of New York, and you might stay here to have close access to things like the shopping centers and the department stores, et cetera, now that is kind of no longer as relevant, and people want to live near Times Square, or stay near Times Square, or where the action is happening in other parts of the city. Stuart can put up some shots there of the old Waldorf-Astoria before it closed, and some of the elegance and grandeur that the building evoked. At the moment, what's happening is what a lot of Midtown hotels are doing. They are closing down the building. They are going to try and rip out a lot of the hotel rooms and replace them with expensive condominiums and apartments, and then use the capital raised from those sales to try and reopen the hotel with a smaller capacity. So that's the current plan. Whether they'll be successful or not, who knows? But it kind of speaks to the idea that Midtown is, kind of changing once again, and I guess nothing is forever. We're going to walk now down towards Grand Central Station. You can see down the end of Park Avenue this slew of tall buildings that have come up in recent years. One of the most famous, you can see the word on there, MetLife, emerging out of it. This is the most hated building in New York, this tall kind of modernist office block rising out the back. It was built right on top of Grand Central Station in the 1960s by Juan Tripp, who was the president of Pan Am. It was originally called the Pan Am Building. The reason was pretty simple. It was supposed to kind of demonstrate the dominance of the airline industry over trains. And so initially from the MetLife building, you could actually get a helicopter ride to Idlewild Airport from the middle of the city, sort of indicating that the age of the airplane had arrived and the age of the train had ended. That hasn't continued. You can no longer get direct helicopter rides to Grand Central, and actually trains are kind of making a return to New York. But this is kind of the way that architecture also reflects the politics and technology of the era. Park Avenue, which we're walking on the top two, is also... Actually,
Matthew, sorry, I'll just interrupt you because I'm just showing the slide up of the Pan Am building with the helicopter taking off, the very classic image. But it's also worth noting the Chrysler Building, which is right next to it. See how dirty the the spire of the Chrysler Building is. And this is very symptomatic of that 1980s where the city was in disrepair, it was going bankrupt, nobody cared less about things. And we'll see the difference between that image of the 1970s, 1980s and today when Matthew gets down to closer to Grand Central.
So the other building that we're kind of bearing under at the moment is the Helmsley Building. This is another building from the 1920s, although notably not done in Art Deco style. It was deliberately done in a kind of a 19th century French Renaissance revival style. The Helmsley Building is famous for lighting up at night. You can pay for whatever kind of color scheme you want, and probably on Memorial Day tomorrow it'll be lit up in red, white, and blue, for example. It's also named after Harry Helmsley, who was sort of another major real estate developer like Donald Trump. His wife, though, is much more famous, Leona Helmsley, the original Queen of Mean, a woman who took over Harry Helmsley's empire and was sort of a major real estate baroness in the city throughout the 1980s and 1990s. We're going to cross under the Helmsley building to get into Grand Central, and it's probably a good time, Stuart, if you've got any questions, because visually it's not that interesting going under this little part.
Yeah, actually, there's still my favourite story about Leona Helmsley. She was actually tried for tax evasion, tax fraud, and one of her maids actually testified against her. And the testimony, the maid testified that Leona Helmsley said, only little people like you pay taxes. I don't pay taxes. And she got such an evil reputation. And she left her fortune, which was quite sizable, to her dog.
Yes,
a trust fund, and the dog ended up living down in Miami. They had to fly under security in its own plane down to Miami because it was so much money. They were worried it was going to get kidnapped. But in her will, she left the allowances for the dog to be fed caviar and expensive foods. But I think the reality is the former assistant who ended up looking after the dog just gave it normal old dog food and pocketed most of the money.
Classic. Yes, I think the whole tax evasion scheme was only uncovered because she refused to pay like a Connecticut floor installer, like she'd owe the refund of like $250 or something, or under invoice, like some ridiculously small amount. And this little floor cleaner actually took it to court, and eventually they had to open the books as a result of it. So, yeah, ridiculous.
It's actually kind of interesting. As you're walking through into Grand Central Terminal, people don't realise you're walking through the Helmsley Building, underneath the Helmsley Building, what was the Pan Am Building, the MetLife Building, and in it, so it is all still part of this massive terminal complex. And the railways actually make more money out of the renting, the office space, the airspace above the terminal, the train tracks, than they do out of actually selling tickets on the trains. And this gives a really good idea of just the size of Grand Central Terminal, the whole massive complex it takes up.
Yeah, hopefully the signal does okay as we walk through here, as we walk through the MetLife Building to Grand Central Terminal. We might crackle in and out a little bit, but
no, it's all going well.
Good. Actually, Sterling's a bit ahead of me, so I'll have to run.
That's a stunning camera work from Sterling of the Grand Concourse.
Yeah, so here we are at Grand Central Terminal. This is the iconic center of the railroad industry here in New York City. It was this particular incarnation of Grand Central was built in 1913. It was carried on top of the original Grand Central, was built in the 1870s by the Vanderbilts. The New York Central Railroad was Cornelius Vanderbilt's brainchild, and one of the original robber baron fortunes were made of this. This 1913 version by Warren and Wetmore replaced it, and it's famous, of course, for its Grand Central Terminal's roof, which depicts a whole lot of constellations up the top there. They're just making an announcement, so I'll be quiet for 1 second. So the ceiling was done by an artist named Paul Halou, and it depicts a whole lot of the constellations of the zodiac and what can be seen in the northern skies above New York. Although apparently, and I was told this by an astronomer who came on one of my tours years ago, they are in the correct order across that they would go across the sky, but they've been mirrored or flipped. So the constellations are actually back to front, possibly caused by some sort of translation error between looking at a sheet and trying to paint it up there. So there are 46 different tracks that come into Grand Central Terminal. Where we were walking down Park Avenue would have been originally all railroad tracks coming in and out of the building. So it's kind of incredible now today that cars just sort of drive over the top of it, and you couldn't really tell that earlier history. But when the railroads were electrified, that's when they were able to kind of cover over it with street and move out all of those kind of railroad tracks and stick them underneath the ground. Today, I mean, most of the lines that go out here go to upstate New York and other places. There's also connections to the New York City Metro underneath. The clock in the middle of the Grand Central Terminal is the famous meeting place in New York, one of the most iconic ones. Now, we just have to figure out how to escape from this building to go to the Chrysler because they've closed it off here.
Oh,
so,
yeah. Vanderbilt Hall's closed off. Yeah.
Who knows why, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah. A beautiful can Sterling just pan across the west entrance? Is Cipriani's still there, the restaurant up on the balcony?
Oh, yeah, you can see it. Yeah, Cipriani's is up there.
Okay, our groups have enjoyed many a lunch up at Cipriani, sitting on the balcony there. That's great.
We can just go out that entrance, actually. How about we go out there? Yep.
Yeah.
That one's open.
Yeah. Just while Matthew's making his way out, I'll just share with you a slide. Grand Central has been used for a lot of various exhibitions, whatever, but probably one of the more bizarre ones was after Sputnik had been launched by the Soviets. The American people were fearful that the Russians were going to bomb them from space, whatever. So the present time, Eisenhower did a tour around the country of a Mercury rocket to show off the might and the power of the American military. And they even hosted it here in Grand Central Terminal. And here's a slide of the rocket, Redstone rockets sitting there in Grand Central, showing off to reassure their populace that Americans were able to defend this country against the Soviet Sputnik. And in fact, there is a small hole in the ceiling of Grand Central where they had forgotten to measure the rocket properly, the base, and they had to chip a small hole out to fit the whole rocket in, and the hole was still up there in the ceiling.
All right, we've made our way out of Grand Central, and we're now on 42nd Street, famous from the name of the musical. And we're going to cross over the street here, and you get a good view of the exterior of Grand Central Terminal. There's a huge Tiffany clock mounted over the front top of the station. And you can see this roadway that also goes up to Grand Central. Park Avenue continues and goes right around Grand Central Terminal. So cars drive over this bridge, drive around Grand Central Terminal, and then descend back onto Park Avenue through the bottom of the Helmsley Building. Quite an interesting design. Oh. Fight.
I was hoping we'd get some sirens sometime, I think, because they don't call New York the city that never sleeps. The main reason is because there's constantly sirens running, blowing through the streets all night long.
There's a band going on as well. It's all happening. And there we get to see the famous shot, well, a famous shot of the Chrysler Building. The Chrysler, really the high point of the Art Deco era, completed in 1931. The architect was William Van Allen, and it was the tallest building in the world until the Empire State Building opened about 11 months later. the Chrysler Building was designed originally as a showpiece in the Fortune empire of Walter P. Chrysler, a major automotive manufacturer who wanted a office block but also a car showroom right in the middle of New York. So initially, these lower floors were all showrooms for Chrysler vehicles, and up the top were offices that were eventually used to be the home of the Chrysler Corporation. Now, of course, rented out as some of the most expensive office space in the country. The exterior of the Chrysler Building is just gorgeous. Again, it sort of plays on the neo-Gothic idea that we saw on the Woolworth Building, in the sense that there are gargoyles and kind of ornaments on the outside meant to echo the sensibilities of Gothic design, but given a distinctly modern twist. You can't see them so well from here, but in some of the photos I can put in slides, you can see that the gargoyles that were created, for example, the eagle heads, are hood ornaments from Chrysler cars. There's another type of gargoyle a little bit further down too, which is in the shape of radiator caps from the vehicles. So a very innovative and clever kind of way to design the building, to pay homage to the architecture of the past, while very squarely placing itself in the modern era of that time. Of course, very famously up the top, you have the crown of the Chrysler Building, where you can't really get the best shot of it from down here, but the crown was kind of part of a sort of an elaborate plot to make it the tallest building in the city. Yesterday, we saw 40 Wall Street, if you're on the tour with me yesterday, which is now one of the Trump buildings. And they were in a competition, those two buildings, to make them the tallest in the city. So Van Allen and Craig Severance, who were working at the same site as architects in New York, were both scheming on ways to make the building the tallest in New York without tipping off the other, so they wouldn't increase the height of their building and win the competition. So the crown, the sort of famous jewel box crown at the top of the Chrysler, concealed within it the spire that initially sits on the top of the building. And so when the building was capped out, the spire was lifted up through the middle of the crown and concertinaed out to make it a lot taller than they had originally looked like it would be in designs, and thereby kind of winning the competition. And I think we're probably about at time, Stuart. We're kind of ended around the Chrysler Building. Are there any questions at this point?
Yeah, there has been a couple of questions, but just before you do go, can Sterling pan around to that awful Trump building? The Hyatt.
Right, the Hyatt. Yeah. This is a terrible story of New York architecture. You'll see this big sheer glass building, the Grand Hyatt, New York. You might notice, if you can see the details or the outline, that it is got a wedding cake style shape. It has this sort of like a large seat. And so that gives you a clue that maybe it was designed in an earlier era. In fact, this building was a 19th century era building that was facaded around by glass when Trump bought it to make it look modern. And so just underneath that facade, you have the kind of original sort of early 20th century building sort of stuck under there, giving this sort of really odd appearance. It's been a real kind of eyesore in this area, and there's been numerous proposals to knock it down, but nothing's happened with it yet.
Well, one of the questions asked, Leanne's just asking, Memorial Day, what's the significance, what is the meaning of Memorial Day? Why the weekend?
So Memorial Day is, what is this? Maybe Sterling will know. What is the 31st of it? Because there's Veterans Day, which celebrates the armistice, much like we call it Armistice Day. They have Veterans Day here. Memorial Day on the 31st, I'm not exactly sure. It may be the D-Day landings? No, that was June, wasn't it? No, I don't know the answer to exactly why it's on this weekend, but it is probably the main Veterans Day. Veterans Day exists in November, but it's I would say it's the smaller of the two. Memorial Day is the bigger one.
And Janet noticed, because it was some great viewing of the street signs, which themselves are famous, iconic for New York. But back on East 52nd Street, it was named as Israel Bonds Street. That's a great sign there of the street signs. But East 52nd had been renamed Israel Bonds Street. Now, obviously, you can answer this, Ben, but obviously a lot of the streets are named after people they want to honour them, usually policemen killed in duty, or famous people, or famous prime ministers, or whatever, presidents. And the Israel Bond Street, it actually gives you an idea of just the importance of the Jewish lobby in New York, how influential they are, And when the Israel Bonds, which is the Development Corporation of Israel, when they started after the War of Independence, they set up these investment bonds to try and sell them to raise money for the state of Israel in the 1950s. And obviously one of these streets, as part of that strong lobby group in New York and in America, had the street renamed as Israel Bonds. Usually the street will still have the street number, but also have the name of some sort of honouring the street underneath.
Yeah. There are a lot of Jewish names, honorary names on the street. There's a Chaim Weitzman Street. There's a Theodore Herzl Street. There's a lot of, I mean, usually they are prominent people who lived or worked on those streets, but really not always. Like they can be someone who just visited the city, etc. So yeah, a lot of these secondary names is very confusing actually, because some people will, some areas of the city are known better by their honorary name than by their actual name, but they won't extend down the whole street. So the honorary name might just be the blocks above a certain point between two bits. So it gets confusing for taxi drivers when you say, kind of the name street rather than the numbered street.
Actually, Anna very helpful, has helped us out with the question about Memorial Day. Memorial Day is for all veterans who have died in service. So anything from the Civil War through to Afghanistan, whereas Veterans Day is especially on November 11th, so the end of the First World War. It's our Remembrance Day. I suppose you could even liken it to, we have Remembrance Day November 11th here, but we also have Anzac Day being our day for the Anzac. Anyway, so there's a difference with Memorial Day. It's a day off for you, Matthew. It gives you an excuse to come to New York for a long weekend, which we're so appreciative of you coming up from Florida to New York. It's a shame the weather wasn't a lot better for you. Thank you again, and to Sterling as well.